Marvel's second Disney Plus original series, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, released its first episode a year ago today. Well, as long as I get this video out for the 19th, that statement will be true, which I probably won't manage to do, but I guess lots of you wouldn't watch it on release date anyway, so when you're hearing this, even if I do get it out on time, that line probably won't be correct. How about this? As I write this introduction, the first anniversary of The Falcon and the Winter Soldier is approaching, and following my WandaVision video back in January, I thought this was the perfect time to come back with another retrospective. Wow, sorry about that intro. Initially, I thought it was a good idea and it was going well, but the execution was pretty bad. And looking back, there were some pretty deep conceptual issues with the whole thing, which ultimately compromised the overall effectiveness and impact of the project.
Kind of like The Falcon and the Winter Soldier.
No, hold on. While it would be very easy to make this video quite negative, a lot of the shortcomings of The Falcon and the Winter Soldier have been covered before, both by myself and others. Personally, I spoke a month or so ago about how this show epitomizes Marvel's essentially conservative politics, the way these films and shows seem to revel in a sanitized and idealized version of the neoliberal status quo. And oh yeah, a politics warning for this video, I guess. I don't think I should need to clarify that an analysis of The Falcon and the Winter Soldier will get political, but the amount of comments I got on that 26-minute WandaVision video following a literally 2-second reference to January 6th telling me I'd ruined my channel by getting political, or I guess defending that mob of wannabe putschers who tried to do a fascism, makes me think that I maybe should be more forthright that this video essay discussing a show about geopolitical instability, anarchist movements, and the United States' history of systemic oppression and violation towards its minority citizens will touch on politics. Good lord, that was a long sentence. The point I want to make though is that while I highlighted aspects of this show as key examples of Marvel's problem with the idea of a meaningful and non-craven engagement with political themes, I ended that video by noting that throughout Marvel's oeuvre, and particularly in projects like The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, we see indications that these texts aren't uniform in their ideologies, and that there might be small pockets of cultural resistance and progressive thought even in essentially small c conservative texts. And what I'd like to do today is put a little more emphasis on moments like these, the times the show succeeds, thematically and otherwise, and not just turn this retrospective into a catalogue of The Falcon and the Winter Soldier's failures. But equally, I'll try not to sugarcoat things, because there are a lot of things about this project which don't really work that well. Here's a list, just for fun. Sam's speech. The way the power broker leads Zemo and friends to her only source of super soldier serum. The ongoing devotion to franchise building at the expense of individual stories, more on that below, or the utter lack of character the show gives to 90% of the Flag Smashers. And oh yeah, how about the fact that Carly Morgenthal's backstory and goals were too sympathetic and made too much sense for a studio which clearly wanted to tell a shallow both sides bad story. So they had to go and make her a murderer for no reason so the audience wouldn't side with her and against the show's avatars of the neoliberal status quo. Don't worry, there's plenty more criticisms to make, and we will make them. That was just the starter, the poppadoms that come before the main curry, if you will. But now, here, take this wrist thingy, because we're going back in time to 2021. In case you've made it this far into the video without having seen the show, first of all, well done. Second, here's a quick recap. The Falcon and the Winter Soldier was Marvel's second Disney Plus show, and it focused on, well, the Falcon and the Winter Soldier. After the loss of the original Captain America, Steve Rogers during the events of Avengers Endgame, during which the mantle had been passed to Sam Wilson, aka the Falcon, a hole is left in the lives of those who knew Cap, and also in the government's propaganda/powered agent quotient. So over the course of 6 episodes, we follow Steve's ex-partners and best buds, Sam Wilson and James Bucky Barnes, the latter of whom is formerly a brainwashed Soviet assassin by the name of the Winter Soldier, as they try to protect Steve's legacy as Captain America and try to keep on top of the rising threat of super soldier serum proliferation. These issues unite first and foremost in the form of John Walker, who the government designate the new Captain America. John is a veteran and seems to be a good fair man, but he has a couple of major flaws which to us, and and to our titular pair of heroes make him unfit to bear the shield. First, there's his sense of exceptionalism and self-importance. Whereas Steve maintained a healthy skepticism of the government throughout his tenure, Walker seems to lack this, initially at least. He views the American state, and by extension himself, as an unassailable righteous authority. And look, here's some mild praise. Viewing Walker interact with foreign citizens in friendly countries becomes a fairly interesting metaphor for real-life ways that America likes to, let's say, push countries about. We'll talk a bit more about that side of things later, but in Walker, this quality is exacerbated by his pretty awful emotional state and anger problems. I'm sure there's a sympathetic way to read these issues, linked perhaps to his veterancy, but regardless, these flaws mean that our heroes aren't going to recognize his claim to the Captain America mantle as legitimate. This lack of recognition only intensifies Walker's issues, and that's the recipe for a pretty cool antagonistic dynamic, one which escalates as Walker steals a knockoff super soldier serum. Obviously, this only exaggerates his pre-existing flaws, culminating in a rage-filled execution of a surrendering opponent in the middle of Riga. After this, the US government rescinds his position, but he continues to operate regardless, and we'll talk more about this ending later, but I do think that largely Walker works well as a villain and a foil for Sam. It's hard to say the same, though, for the other villains, the Flag Smashers. The Flag Smashers are a group of displaced refugee kids who, during the chaos of the snap, ended up forming a sort of family across nationalities and cultures. It's important to know that during this period, it seems that geopolitics greatly changed. Due to the common challenges facing the world, borders were looser, international cooperation expanded, and generally the world was less a collection of divided nations and more a united group of people struggling together against common problems. After the blip, though, after the world was restored to a semblance of normalcy, the Earth reverted to nationalism and conflict, shutting borders tight in a time of unprecedented population displacement. Now, some of the above details come from the Flag Smashers themselves, so it's possible that they're exaggerated to some degree, but the general picture seems to be accurate, largely corroborated by the actions of various organizations and governments we see during the series, such as the Global Repatriation Council, who are attempting to uproot displaced snap survivors from wherever they ended up and return them to the countries they lived in back in 2018, despite however much their lives or those countries might have changed in the interim. This becomes one of the primary points of contention in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, but it's important to remember that opposing this isn't the ideological endgame for the Flag Smashers. This resettlement is merely one specific example of the larger regression to nationalism against which the Flag Smashers are fighting. So yeah, make sure you have that distinction in your mind for the rest of the video. It's the general trend away from a kind of collectivist world order and back towards late capitalism, which drives Carly and friends towards activism, because this group of, again, refugee kids who would become the Flag Smashers were appalled by this. The preceding half-decade had shown that change was possible, international cooperation was possible, and a move beyond nationalism, beyond tribalism was possible. But the great miraculous blip, which restored billions to life, dragged the world backwards to the normal, exclusionary, warmongering, nationalist status quo of the pre-snap world. Our world, in fact, which, yeah, is pretty bad. Carly Morgenthau and co. watched in disbelief at this backslide, and became determined to try to preserve the positive changes which had occurred following Thanos. But the world didn't listen. The newly restored powers that be were more interested in going back to business as usual, with the emphasis squarely on business, humanitarian cost be damned. So in an attempt to equip themselves with the ability to make change, and in an echo of the original Captain America origin, this group, the Flag Smashers, seek out a new super soldier serum being manufactured in the bowels of Madripoor's criminal underworld. They're granted this boon by a mysterious figure known as the Power Broker, who preys on these kids' idealism in order to gain some muscled up super kids in her debt, and then promptly tries to force them to act as her enforcers. Obviously this isn't what they want, so they escape, and this newly empowered group of activist refugee kids goes on the run, stopping here and there to hit banks and other institutions supporting bodies like the GRC, all the while building a following of like-minded people. Now, if you're thinking, wow, these don't sound like villains at all, then yeah, they don't. And that's a realization which seems to have dawned on the writing team fairly late in the day, hence the aforementioned moment where Carly, their leader, murders a bunch of security guards. Problem solved, we made one of the kinda groomed refugee activist kids into a mass murderer, a change which goes so far against the picture we're given of her backstory and the ideals of her movement that even her teammates and friends are taken aback by it.
There were still people in there.
This is the only language these people understand.
We'll talk more later about why the Flag Smashers story failed so hard, but yeah, this is all happening alongside the John Walker stuff, and it culminates in a fairly nonsensical attack by the increasingly hardline Flag Smashers against the GRC on the eve of the big vote over this resettlement thing. Because everyone knows that if you kill or kidnap the voters, the policy they were voting on just magically disappears. It's like how if your teacher doesn't show up after 15 minutes, you're legally allowed to leave. And throughout all of this, of course, our heroes are dealing with their own issues. Sam had initially given up the shield, but after seeing the mockery Walker made of the Captain America role, he recommits to the position Steve had tried to give him. Along the way though, he has to grapple with the relationship he has as a black man with his country, whether he in good conscience should or even could represent a country with such a deeply flawed and oppressive past, and perhaps a deeply flawed and oppressive present. One of the best parts of this story, and indeed the whole show, comes when Sam meets Isaiah Bradley, a previous African-American Captain America of sorts, who, despite performing very similar feats of heroism to Steve Rogers in World War II, subsequently faced a horrifying, nightmarish life directly at the hands of the US government, with his experiences directly evocative of atrocities like the Tuskegee syphilis study. As a result, Isaiah is a surprisingly powerful and moving voice of doubt in Sam's ear.
They will never let a black man be Captain America. No self-respecting black man would ever want to be.
Have things changed? Really? The show makes it clear throughout that there are still institutional factors throughout American life making things objectively worse for the African-American citizens, in moments such as the police stop and the bank loan sequence, which, yeah, is for made-up reasons, but you know, it's a metaphor. This is pretty powerful stuff, and Carl Lumley acts the heck out of it. There was an earlier section of this video where I sort of criticised the Isaiah plotline, the way it resolves in episode 6, because I didn't feel the finale, with the kind of shallow conclusion it gives to the political themes, did enough to earn the big shift in outlook we see from Isaiah. Here's a snippet of that section. Having Isaiah mollified by the recognition of his own cruel treatment doesn't work in the neat, tidy way the finale seems to suggest, because the real historical atrocities which inspired the creation of Isaiah go entirely unresolved, and in the finale, unaddressed. It's the show commendably bringing up a serious and wide-reaching issue, and then less commendably trying to wrap it up neatly in an unearned bow shortly thereafter. But the bow doesn't fit, and as a result, the whole enterprise starts to feel hollow. As we'll see, this is something of a running theme. The thing is, in the process of making this video, I've rewatched all those scenes a bunch of times, and now I think I was being a bit too harsh. So I'm still not convinced by the tidy and quick way Isaiah seems to get back on the Captain America bandwagon, but I think my previous opinion was a bit too harsh, so now I'm genuinely not sure where I stand on how tidily this all wraps up. I'd be really interested in hearing some of your takes on Isaiah's ending below. Is it earned, is it too saccharine, or does it ring true? Please do let me know. There's slightly less depth and less focus when it comes to Bucky's side of things, but I think that's kind of inevitable. I think this did need to be Sam's story primarily, so the show could have time to ask questions about race, government, and service. Even if not everyone was satisfied by the way those questions got asked, or the answers the show suggests, it would have been pretty disastrous if the show had positioned that side of things as narratively subordinate to Bucky and his guilt and burdens. It is a shame, though, how little time we spend exploring these latter topics, because the solo Bucky bits we do get are interesting and affecting. It's about him making amends for the crimes he inadvertently committed while under Hydra hypnosis, and this plays out in high-octane ways.
Rule number 2.
What was rule number 2?
Nobody gets hurt. It's a big one.
Then why isn't it rule number 1?
As well as calmer, more subdued ones. These ideas bubble through into the main story too, particularly in the Madripoor sequence, and they remain dramatic highlights of the show for me on rewatch. I think it's important to remember that when this show was coming out, it wasn't viewed as the mixed bag that it's often framed as today. Coming after WandaVision, the hype was real, and even if The Falcon and the Winter Soldier didn't make the most of the weekly releases and the new television format in the same way that WandaVision did, pretty much the whole way through the airing of The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, people were raving about it. Part of this was because, well, memory tends towards hyperbole. Even now, if you think this show was a complete fumble, go back and rewatch it. You'll probably have a good time, as long as you don't dwell on the messy themes too much. And part of this is because there were some really cool cliffhangers and twists scattered throughout the series. That moment at the end of episode 1, where Walker is revealed as the new Captain America, that had everyone shook. Truly, deeply, seismically shooketh. Similar, if less impactful moments followed, like the Zemo reveal at the end of episode 2, or the really powerful shot of Walker's bloodied shield at the end of episode 4, which we'll discuss shortly. No, the reputation of this series only fell after the finale, which was a mostly fine conclusion to the series, but one which felt sort of incomplete and slightly disappointing in a number of ways. Most obviously, yeah, Sam's speech, but there's also the way that a lot of the character arcs ended on a bit of a flat note. I like Sam's arc for the most part. If I were to summarize and simplify my interpretation of Sam's journey over this series, I'd probably describe it as Sam initially rejecting the Captain America mantle because he feels imperfect, unworthy of the impressive legacy MCU Cap had built. Over the course of the series though, it becomes clearer and clearer that the mantle of Captain America and the country it represents, these things are also far from perfect, and that it doesn't matter if he isn't either, so long as he's trying to be better, to make up for mistakes past. That's a fun point of convergence between Sam's journey and Bucky's, in fact. The issue is that through Walker's careless actions and ideology of exceptionalism and unipolarity, he's doing the opposite. He's dragging the symbol down. That's what creates Sam's desire to take back the shield, in contrast to Bucky's more personal motivations for the same end. This arc tracks as long as you watch the finale with your brain off and don't recognize that despite its be better theme, Sam's speech doesn't actually accomplish any particularly groundbreaking change, but we'll dive into that more later. Similarly, Bucky's journey starts off well before ending a bit like a damp squib, because just as we approach what had been built up to be a truly climactic scene, the moment where Bucky tells his elderly friend the truth about his son's untimely demise, we cut away. We don't see the scene. The arc is still ultimately a satisfying one since we see Bucky make this final decision to tell Yori the truth, but in a weirdly masochistic decision, the big satisfying finish is pulled away from us. When the Disney Plus TV division of Marvel Studios was announced, many people were on board for one major reason: that these longer project runtimes meant, in theory at least, that there would be more time for character moments, more time for slower, more subtle storytelling, and character examinations which wouldn't make it into the already overstuffed feature film runtimes. This missing Bucky scene is the exact type of moment which people were looking forward to finally getting, and we still didn't get it. The MCU has long had an issue with implied character growth, with a great deal of important developments happening off-screen. Look at Wanda and Vision's relationship. We go from a handful of scenes in Civil War, where these characters are getting to know each other and their chemistry is growing, to the opening of Infinity War, where they're so deep in their relationship, so in love with each other, that they're both willing to abandon their teams. And after, again, a couple of minutes worth of romantic stuff in that movie, we go pretty much straight into WandaVision, which relies on our buying into the immense tragic love story of Wanda and Vision. WandaVision is very emotionally affecting, and due primarily to the fantastic performances of the leads, we can buy into this melodrama, but we never saw any of it. We never saw their relationship start, grow, struggle, any milestones, any difficulties, anything really. We just have to accept the fact that it all apparently happened at one point. Disney Plus was supposed to help end this phenomenon. The longer runtimes were supposed to allow us to actually explore these characters, rather than see them show up, punch some guys, crack some jokes, and then depart for some more off-screen development. But the reason the abortive end of Bucky's arc in this show is so galling is that we're still not allowed moments like this. The only reason I'm not being harsher on the Falcon and the Winter Soldier or Marvel over this issue is that while we didn't get to see much of the above scene, we do get a really powerful emotional scene carried entirely by Sebastian Stan's performance earlier in the show, the Wakanda flashback. This, again, is one of those scenes which might not have made it into a movie, so I'm thankful we got that, if little else, because Stan really lets loose with the scene. It's a real emotional release, and one of the high points of the entire project. And on the topic of acting, everyone does a pretty good job here, even the side characters, like Emily Van Camp and Daniel Bruhl. While the whole Agent 13/Power Broker story is a little predictable and by the numbers, Van Camp does a good job at bringing the new sneaky double-faced version of this character to life, in a way that feels genuinely different from her earlier appearances in the franchise. And Bruhl similarly changes up his Zemo in a way which feels fresh and exciting, leading to the Baron becoming something of a scene stealer. Of all this show's characters, I think I'm looking forward to seeing this guy again the most. But going back to the major characters and the way their arcs sometimes fall a bit flat, I think we have to talk about the weird quasi-redemption arc for Walker. This comes an episode after he tried to murder our titular heroes, in a scene which itself came just after he actually did murder someone who was trying to surrender. After this, after he is stripped of his title, he makes a homemade Captain America shield, charges into the fray during the Flag Smasher attack on the GRC, and in what's framed as a pivotal moment, he lets Carly go in order to save a truck full of falling politicians. After this, he turns up again later in the episode working with Bucky, cracking wise and catching Flag Smashers. Our heroes then let him go, and while they don't seem to be best buds at the end of the show, they're definitely no longer openly antagonistic. I think the episode wants us to view Walker's decision to save the dying civilians as the thing which earns this partial redemption, despite this being, a fairly low bar. But Walker's trajectory didn't sit well with many viewers back when the finale dropped, and yeah, I was one of them. It's hard not to wonder if this weird whiplash movement towards righteousness came as a result of studio interference, since Walker by the end of the series seems positioned fairly well to fill a kinda anti-heroic but ultimately good leader role in the Thunderbolts team Marvel is clearly building towards, but I don't like this. It's too abrupt and it feels kinda gaslighty because the Walker we'd seen in this series is a piece of shit, and whitewashing him of this at the show's close has dark, propagandistic implications for what he represents, thematically speaking, but we'll get to that. Actually, no, I'm sick of saying we'll get to that. Let's get to it now. It's John Walker time. Ahead of this section, I want to explicitly stress that I am not a tanky. The following few minutes will sometimes present American foreign policy in a negative light. That doesn't mean that I'm suggesting that other superpowers are better, because most of the time, no, they're worse. But I think it's important that we're still able to recognize that elements of the West's military policies and histories are kind of not awesome. Great, that's the anti-tanky disclaimer out of the way, let's get back to the show. The part of the series around which I'm going to frame my discussion of John Walker is the events of episode 4 and episode 5. Walker's intervention in Riga, culminating in his execution of Nico the Flag Smasher, and the hearing which follows, officially stripping Walker of his Captain America role. At the end of this though, we get this exchange.
Senator, I am Captain America.
Not anymore.
Walker is Captain America. Sam and Bucky disagree. The senators evidently disagree. The viewer, after having seen the previous Captain America films and Walker's misdeeds in this series, feels a strong urge to disagree. The thing is though, he's kinda right. He does represent America, or at least America as seen by its critics. Let's take a look at Walker's lowest moment, the aforementioned execution of Nico. I know there's some Walker apologists out there, so let's just be clear. This is murder, and it isn't justified in any way. First, Nico was surrendering. Killing a surrendering combatant is literally a war crime, and yet there's some pea-brains out there who've argued that he might have been faking a surrender. Since he's a super soldier, he's never truly disarmed, so Walker couldn't be sure. Well, hey, guess what? Walker's just as juiced as Nico, so the power balance between the two is the same as any soldier and any surrendering opponent. And even ignoring that, denying a man the ability to surrender, regardless of his strength or abilities, that's pretty psychopathic. And oh yeah, also, he didn't do anything. He didn't kill Lamar, Carly did. This guy was in Carly's crew, but it's made very explicit that Carly, in killing Lamar, was acting outside the Flag Smasher's established plans and parameters. This isn't on Nico, and if you seriously try to argue otherwise, that's a pretty big L. So any way you slice it, this is evil, and it's pretty war crimey. And this brutal, monstrous fate is doled out by an American flag. This shot immediately after of the stars and stripes covered in the blood of an illegal paramilitary execution is probably the most symbolically powerful moment of the entire series. Because while many Americans in the audience probably just took it as a shock factor moment, gosh darn it, they done desecrated our flag, that kind of response, a lot of the global audience would have understood the image as a reflection of all the times in the past and the present that the American military have done kinda similar things. I'm trying to avoid a demonetization, so you'll have to forgive me for not diving into a catalogue of specific examples in gruesome detail, but just go looking for yourself, because there's plenty of heinous shit the US pulled off in Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, or any number of other places before or since. Just look at that time that America decided to use one of its drones to shower a wedding in Kandahar with some extra confetti, and by extra confetti I of course mean live ammunition. What we see in Nico's execution then is a metaphorical restaging of these brutalities, and it's made even more potent by something Nico had said earlier in the episode.
You know, when I was a kid, I was actually a Captain America fan. He made me believe that there was decent people in this world.
If Nico was driven to fight for change by Steve Rogers, by a previous benevolent image of American idealism, then the fact that he's now getting war-crimed by that image's modern equivalent is truly worth thinking about, because it appears to be a fairly bold critique of America's often bloody foreign policy, and thus perhaps constitutes one of those pockets of resistance I mentioned in this video's introduction. And if the original Captain America was Captain America because he physically represented one facet of the country's foreign policy at the time, becoming a one-man army helping to liberate Europe from the Germans, then John Walker's Captain America title is valid, because he too represents the American military on the world stage, the impact of which nowadays is often seen as less positive than during the Second World War. The show suggests that John Walker too is Captain America, because he is a mirror image of US foreign policy, and that on one level, the man's outrage at being discharged is valid, because the very politicians stripping him of his position are the figures primarily responsible for the bellicose, morally dubious America which he has reflected too faithfully. They made him. They made this Captain America, both directly through his military service and indirectly through the last few decades of foreign policy, and the moment their little propaganda project starts to reflect badly on the system which churned it out, they disavow Walker entirely. But this is the Captain America they made, and it's the Captain America they deserve. In a way, Walker is a truer Captain America than Steve ever was. The reason Steve became a true hero was that he went beyond what he was told to do, and against the chain of command, and by extension the American state itself, see his liberation of the Hydra POWs in the first Avenger, or pretty much all of Civil War. The way Steve's actions do always seem to be correct is a little weird, and it's probably a topic for another video, but that's not the point. The point is that Walker is a far more faithful servant to, and indeed often a better reflection of, the American state than Steve ever was, especially its failures. The character, the John Walker of episodes 4 and 5, is an interesting exploration of American militarism and what it represents globally. And for Marvel standards, a pretty complex one. There are limitations to it, of course, some major, and I'm open to talking more about these in the future, perhaps in a Patreon video, but this is a franchise steeped in Pentagon funding, and of glorification of America's armed forces, so I feel even a limited critique is reason for some amount of praise. Until the redemption. Until that bloody redemption. It's far too easy, it's unearned, and it hinges on our characters not holding Walker's past crimes against him. And if they don't care about the execution either, then how exactly are they better than him? There's 1,000 ways to look at this little mini redemption arc, and all of them lessen the rhetorical and political heft of the previous episodes and their events. But perhaps the most damaging part of this is the way it alters the metaphor for Walker's flawed latter-day Cap as American militarism. Because if Walker's forgiven, or at least tolerated so soon after his gamer moment, then all the civilian casualties, all the sponsored coups, all the other assorted real historical gamer moments are now forgivable too. Presumably the studio had some impact on this ending. Clearly the powers that be at Marvel Studios have future plans for Walker, and didn't want him to end this show as an unequivocal villain. But I don't care how many projects they want Walker to appear in. That's a reason for this ending, it's not an excuse. I'm perfectly aware that US Agent as a character has a past of doing kinda bad things, and then working his way back to a semi-respectable status, but I don't care about that either. Textual inspirations and future plans don't make this awful mess of a message any better. This is Marvel trying to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted to try and tell a real political story with themes, stakes, and consequences, but they also wanted to introduce a bunch of characters which they could continue to use and reuse in different contexts for the next few years. But the thing is, if you walk back the only real point you make in order to protect a character's potential for reappearance, then guess what? That also has consequences. It invalidates the gesture you were trying to make. This was a powerful gesture, and a really cool shot, and if it were from a different show, a less defanged show, which actually committed to exploring its themes, it could have gone on to become iconic, but it's not from a different show. So in a way, the only real thing this shot demonstrates is the limitations of this project. Alright, John Walker time is, it's done, it's over now. So yeah, the single biggest metaphorical swing this show takes is reduced to an empty and craven gesture by its close. On a technical level though, the show often succeeds. The action, the fight scenes here are probably the best that Marvel Disney Plus has to offer. Set pieces like the opening sky battle thing, the Winter Soldier flashback, the Battlestar death scene, and the Dora Milaje confrontation have a physicality to them that Marvel doesn't always manage to bring. In moments like these, or Sam and Bucky's showdown with Walker in episode 5, the direction and choreography are unique enough from standard Marvel fare that we never forget that these are people first and heroes second. It feels like it matters when one of our heroes takes a hit, and that helps to ground the action. And after Sam becomes Captain America, his fight scenes feel different to what we'd seen with Steve. But there are moments which really live up to the potential of this new Captain America and his different power set, like the helicopter window smash bit. I don't know what to call it, but here, this bit. That's a really cool moment, and it's a moment which wouldn't have worked with another hero. Bits like this aren't just cookie-cutter action, they're imaginative, and you can tell whoever came up with it was having fun with the visual possibilities of a winged Captain America. It's also commendable that in terms of choreography and physical performance, there's a stark difference visible between pre-Serum Walker and post-Serum Walker. Wyatt Russell gives a brilliant performance more broadly, of course, but I do think it's worth praising specifically the unhinged fiery energy in Walker following his consumption of the serum. And speaking of Walker, his costume, both in blue and black, is really well done. It looks great, and it's a really nice visual marker that this is very much the Wish Captain America. When the show aired, I remember there were lots of posts going round, supposedly from amateur costume designers or fashion experts or whatever, which broke down in detail just why this costume fit Walker so well. So if I can find any of these, I'll put them on screen now. Staying on the topic of visuals, Bucky looks great as always. There's not much to say here because it's pretty much just Sebastian Stan, and you know, that's about as good as superhero looks get, especially with shorter hair. And although Sam's Captain America costume doesn't look brilliant, I think there are some good ideas in the look, and that it's only really a few tweaks away from being fine. Don't ask me what they are though, I'm not a costume designer and I have no idea. This visual and technical success is less consistent when it comes to the world beyond the characters though. The show's environments and its cinematography often come across as washed out and dull. Particularly across the 2 episodes we spend in Riga, there's really not much done to give these locations character, and by the time the action moves on, we've seen the same almost identical backdrops so many times it's beginning to feel like an Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. episode. It's odd that the show is so often underwhelming in this department, coming as it does in between WandaVision and Loki, both of which are projects which poured lavish attention upon their visuals and settings. The big exception to this though is Madripoor, which feels bright and alive, or it does initially at least, until our heroes manage to wind up in a corner of the city which against all odds shares the same washed out greyness of the Russo Captain America films. I do really like the visual style of the show when it switches gears and shows us Sam at home in Louisiana though. The colours are warm and the homestead feels comfortable and lived in. This whole section of the show is great and almost certainly my favourite part, but I'll come back to that because I want to end this video on a positive note. Before we get there though, I want to pick apart some other aspects of the story and its themes which have so far evaded discussion, starting with a common complaint I've seen against the show. Did it even really matter? Or more specifically, could a viewer skip the Falcon and the Winter Soldier entirely and go on to watch the next slate of Marvel films without having missed anything essential? Well, Yes and no. It's obviously too early to cite specifics since the films in question haven't come out yet, but in a narrow sense there's obviously going to be elements of this show referenced in the future, like Sharon's new role as the power broker or Walker reappearing. The point some like to make though is that since Sam had accepted the shield in Endgame, this show being the story of how he became Captain America means it's positioned, intentionally or not, as a skippable project. And while WandaVision and Loki both seem to set up the multiverse or the future of Phase 4, I agree that it's not great that this one, the one exploring racial issues and such, is the least essential from the perspective of the overall universe narrative. But to be honest, I'm less interested in questions like this. It doesn't matter to me if a project is skippable or not, whatever skippable might mean. It matters what the project is, what's in it, what it says, and how it says it. So let's finish by taking on possibly the biggest blunder of the entire series, that is Sam's speech, and the depressing way it saps the show of most of its leftover potency. When the show first aired, and people were critical of this ending, I was initially reluctant to join them. Come on, I thought, it's a really cool moment. It's the fantasy of speaking truth to power that we all have, and in my quest to interpret the speech as something which worked, I thought a lot about symbolic power. Maybe it mattered that Sam, as the symbol of the country, was defending the ideals of the Flag Smashers, rewriting their narrative at the highest levels. And maybe it mattered, after the second Captain America in Walker demonstrated just how far the US had fallen from the idealism which drove Steve, that Sam, the new Cap, recognized the necessity to do better. But as the weeks wore on, and the copium wore off, I started to realize that my optimism was misplaced, and that this big conclusion is a misfire. Because even if this is a big kick-ass moment displaying a new symbolic power for Sam, which again I'm not convinced it is, why is that all he gets? Steve got to make actual, concrete changes to this world again and again. He saved the US from being bombed by the Red Skull, decimated Hydra, and helped turn the tide of World War II. He also forced S.H.I.E.L.D. to disband, a fairly seismic change to the setting of the MCU, and one which the films have more or less taken seriously. Why then is Sam not afforded the same liberty? All he gets to do is kinda influence the vote for a made-up policy decision, the results of which I guarantee you will never come up again. I've talked previously about the way Marvel films all tend to gesture towards progressivism while actually reinforcing the socio-economics and ideology of the neoliberal status quo, and if you click in the corner of the screen there should be a card that leads to a video where I talk about that in greater depth, in which, among other things, I discuss the way this dynamic plays out in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. The TLDR though is that one thing Marvel likes to do is create villains who represent uncomfortably radical extremes of political thought, have their heroes defeat them, but then have them realize that on some level the villain had a legitimate criticism of the way things are, and end by making some symbolic gesture towards pursuing change at an acceptably milquetoast level. That's what this big GRC vote is for in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Sam can influence a political body to make a decision to keep borders kinda open for a bit for some refugees, and this makes us all forget that A, the Flag Smashers' aims and grievances were far bigger than this, and B, that's pretty much already the way things work in our world most of the time. So ultimately, Sam's speech changes very little indeed. The great thing about an interconnected franchise like the MCU is that what happens in one story affects the world within which the next stories are told. But the inconvenient thing about these interconnected franchises is that what happens in one story affects the world within which the next stories are told. In The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Marvel set out to tell a story driven by ideology, bringing in as primary antagonists a group who want to break down national borders and unite the divided peoples of the world against their common struggles. Throughout the series, Sam seems surprisingly amenable to their perspectives, but at one point or another, the show's writers must have realized that they'd bitten off more than they could chew, because the Flag Smashers' ideology, their aims, are comparable to beliefs actually held by a lot of real people, mostly across the anarchist and leftist spectrums. I should clarify that I'm not an anarchist myself, but the thing is, if you're going to base your villains on actual philosophical ideals held by a great number of sound-minded, non-villainous individuals, then unless you actually spend a lot of time and effort planning and bringing up valid political counter-arguments in your show, a thing which The Falcon and the Winter Soldier does not do, you're going to have a hard time convincing the audience that these villains, these Flag Smashers, don't maybe have a point. And if the audience is siding with the Flag Smashers, then the heroes have to also, or the show isn't going to work. And there's the issue, because Marvel can't afford Sam to side with the anarchist refugee kids and accomplish meaningful change against borders or nationalism, because then they'd have to stick to that across the future of the MCU. Think about how much work it would be for the writers of Marvel's Phases 4, 5, 6 and beyond to filter every script, every idea through a change like this. And what about if someone didn't see the show which caused all of this upheaval because they didn't have a Disney Plus subscription? They'd probably be less likely to go and see future films if the world of the MCU had changed noticeably. No, it's far simpler for Marvel if nothing fundamentally changes as a result of the Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and that means the politics of this political thriller have to be warped. The show itself cannot afford for Sam to agree too strongly with what is essentially a legitimate ideology, because it already knows that it wouldn't be able to end in a fitting way if this were to happen. So Carly has to go nuts and turn a peaceful movement into a homicidal one in order to lay the groundwork for a big finale with a big empty resolution which accomplishes nothing except denying Sam Wilson's Captain America the ability to actually change his world in a visible way like Steve did before him. Look, I'm not saying this show is bad because it doesn't align with a specific political viewpoint, and this is Disney we're talking about. I'm hardly expecting them to release the next volume of Das Kapital, but that's not the point. This show was hyped up to be a political project. It's very self-consciously trying to make certain points about certain things, or at the very least trying to look like it's making these points. What I'm criticizing here is that the show introduces or references political ideas and philosophies like the pseudo-anarchism of the Flag Smashers and then doesn't engage with them in good faith. That is the problem. The problem with the speech is that it's just a speech. Empty, empty words. But now that I've whinged and cried about the speech like a little goddamn baby for like an hour, I want to move on, because plot twist, I actually have something kind of positive to end on. I think there might be a small section of the Falcon and the Winter Soldier which actually serves as a thematic reflection of the optimistic vision of human cooperation and coexistence the show gestured towards with the Flag Smashers, and that's the story about Sam and his sister's boat. While all the nonsense with the serum, the super soldiers and the Flag Smashers is going on, we sometimes pull away from the action and the intrigue to visit Sam's Louisiana family homestead, where his sister Sarah still lives with her family, and they didn't get snapped. Over the past few years, and particularly since the blip, they've been struggling to make ends meet, highlighted in the first episode where Sam's unable to secure a bank loan despite his status and occupation to help his family keep their boat and their business. But in episode 5, a solution is found. Instead of going to some centralized financial institution like the bank, Sam realizes that help can be found a lot closer to home, because they're part of a community.
You have become something unstoppable. I hereby pronounce you a community.
Oh, that's nice.
No, not like that. Anyway, by acting on their own, outside of the remit of banks or other institutions, this community is able to affect the change they need. The post-blip re-emergence of the financial and political status quo, as decried by the Flag Smashers, has recreated a world much like ours, where governments and banks put profit first and people's lives second, often with a disproportionate impact on minorities and their communities. Sam's inability to secure a loan, despite his years of service to both government entities and private business, seems to represent the failures of late capitalism to provide for even those who believe in and work under these systems. But by rejecting the influence of these centralized institutions and powers, and by instead helping their neighbors in the name of common decency and common humanity, this community and the way it rallies around Sarah and her boat comes fairly close to the future the Flag Smashers were fighting for. It's not a dissolution of nationalism and borders, sure, but it's a community beginning to realize they're able to come together without the mediation of banks, governments, or bodies like the GRC. And when Bucky comes in from outside the community to aid in the process and rejoins them in the celebration which closes the series, we see that the spirit of cooperation isn't limited to physical proximity or culture. The Flag Smashers and the mess this show makes of their politics may have been cast aside, but in this seemingly innocuous side plot, I think we do see the spirit of one world, one people, even if it's on something of a smaller scale. I'm not quite sure how we should square this vibrant localized activity with the very nationalistic mantle Sam adopts at the series' end, and to be honest, I don't really think the show knows either. So this interpretation of the boat plot definitely isn't some hermeneutic silver bullet which zaps away the nonsense and messiness characterizing the rest of the Falcon and the Winter Soldier's politics, but I think it is the biggest and best pocket of ideological resistance to be found within the series, and it makes me pretty happy to think about, because it's honestly awesome that some based experienced writer was able to sneak in a little pastoral slice of optimistic humanism into Capitalism Incorporated's latest show, a vision of an almost anarcho-collectivist future. When I went back and rewatched this show, for all its failings, these sections really put a smile on my face, because I think they tell us that there is still some hope for pop culture and its cultural impact. Because if you can slip something like that past Disney, well, anything's possible. And I think we're best to stop here on this happy note, because otherwise I guarantee I'll remember another big misstep to rant about. So, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. It's generally fine, fun to watch, pretty engaging and gripping from a character and action perspective, at least until the end. But the weird decisions and the bad faith engagement with political themes, which become more and more obvious the more you stop and think about this show, this story and these characters, make this a show which defies classification. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it yet more conservative propaganda? Or is there a beating progressive heart buried somewhere here? After like a really long time, I'm still not sure, but I will say that the reputation this show has gathered since release as a bit of a mess, on balance, is probably fair. Hey, it's me, Pillar of Garbage. I'm just editing the video now, but I think I ought to have clarified something that I didn't in the actual script. I didn't dive too deep into the racial politics of the show because there's only so much insight anyone from outside the US can get into the mess that is American race relations and the minority experience, and I honestly think there's a lot of voices out there better equipped to speak to the specifics of Sam's struggle with the Captain America mantle than me. All I'll say personally is when it comes to these questions, I think episode 5, the boat episode, does a lot of things right, to the point where if you stopped watching there instead of the finale, the show probably gets a lot better. Yeah, that's it. Interjection over. The only thing more nonsensical than some of the show's decisions, though, is the reactions the show provoked in some of its viewers. There's a wealth of awful takes around The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, not least this Forbes article, whose primary problem with a show about a black man becoming Captain America and coming up against an anarchist refugee group is that it's too political. But that's a topic for another time, so if there's any demand for it, I'll maybe cover some of these bad takes in another video in my Critic series. But yeah, I think that's it. This'll probably take me a couple of days to edit, and as I record this, I'm already like 4 days late to upload. So thanks to my regular viewers for your patience. This was never meant to be or take this long, but I thought it was better to be late and in-depth rather than on time and shallow. But if you found this interesting, I'd really appreciate a like, and I'd also love to hear some of your thoughts down below. So huge thanks to all of you for watching, and if you want to support me in my quest to be able to make a living doing this, consider checking out my Patreon linked in the description, because you'll also get some cool exclusive content. Big shout out to everyone already supporting me in this way on screen now, and especially Ian Fifield. I've been Pillar of Garbage, and I'll see you soon.